Welcome to Reset the Algorithm. My special guest today is Gissou Nia. She's a dear friend, someone I met a few years ago when I first got introduced to the Masa Amini activism work, the Women Life Freedom Movement in Iran. She's a director of strategic litigation project at the Atlantic Council. She has been doing this work for, I don't even know, over 12, 13 years now. She started originally at The Hague. She currently sits at the Atlantic Council and has written a book about closing the accountability gap on human rights violations in the Islamic Republic of Iran through litigation strategies. So Gissou is not someone that you want to get into a legal tiff with, because what she's amazing at is looking at global policies and laws and working with various partners across various different policies and countries and thinking about how to get bad guys. And so in this way, she is a bit of a hero to the Iranian people. One massive thing that Gissou Nia did is that she was instrumental in removing the Islamic Republic from the Commission on the Status of Women at the United Nations. And she's really a key person who is pushing the investigations, the crimes against humanity during the uprising. She is the one who's really working with the United Nations on that coalition, their findings, and importantly, helping the world better understand how to talk about the legal process and legal policies that can, in the future, hold this regime accountable. What I really love about Gissou is that she's incredibly humble, she's incredibly well-spoken, and she's incredibly she's done her 10,000, 100,000 hours of specialty around this topic, and her work isn't just around Iran. It also spans into South America and Afghanistan. She's the person who's heading up the efforts around ending gender apartheid. And so with that, let's get into it and welcome Gissou Nia. Hi, Gissou.
Hi, Maj.
Will you kindly introduce yourself? I know you need no introduction, but I would love for you to just take a minute to introduce yourself with your full chest.
I am Gissou Nia, and I'm a lawyer who is specialized on human rights and international criminal law. So a lot of people might ask what that entails and what that is, but basically I started out working on war crimes and crimes against humanity trials in The Hague, the Netherlands, at different international courts. And then in June 2009, there was a disputed presidential election in Iran, and a violent government crackdown on peaceful protesters. And it made me realize that the skills that I learned in The Hague on how to investigate cases, how to interview survivors, how to put evidence together, that could be applied to Iran. And, obviously I have a personal connection to Iran. So instead of working on Kosovo or Bosnia or Kenya, it was something that actually had to do with my ancestry and, a lot of things that I had learned growing up. So it felt very personal. And that's how I got into the work.
Well, I'm really appreciative for you to join us on Reset the Algorithm. And to be honest, when we were thinking about this show, you were one of the first people that came to mind. As someone who's an American-born Iranian human rights attorney, someone who's taught me a lot, but we live in this funny world where the algorithm often favors influencers or storytellers, and they're not always factually accurate. They're not always experts on the topic. They're not always have a deep, robust background like you do. And so one of the goals of this show is to really help reset the algorithm and to push forward thought leaders that we believe have the credibility and the background and the authority to really help educate us. And so with that, I appreciate you doing this show with us, because I think you're one of the most important voices to Iranians for sure. Hands down, every Iranian I know in the diaspora and out of the diaspora knows you and looks up to you. I know it's a lot of pressure for you. And I know that it must feel at times a lot of weight to carry with so many people looking up to you, because we don't have a lot of people like you. Like I can think of a handful of people who do what you do. And so thank you for joining us. I know that was like a long-winded way of saying thank you for joining us. Um, but I am happy to say that I've enjoyed you coming out on the internet a little more. I'm happy to see your videos. I'm happy to see you face to camera talking to us. And I know it's not something you want to be doing. I know it makes you a little uncomfortable and like you're busy. You're busy actually like doing your job and now you're having to be like an Instagram version of doing your job. Like why are you doing it? What is finally
Yeah.
making you come out and full chest, as the internet says, like step into Gissou Nia, the human rights influencer person? Not, like you're not an influencer, but why are you giving up your privacy to come forward and let the world know you?
So you're right. It's definitely not natural for me. I'm not somebody that likes to converse in quippy sound bites or, dress up for the camera or do the things that typically would make a video seen more, right? And get more clicks. It's not really me. But the thing that I learned is that there's loads of Iranians on Instagram, and there's lots of Iranians inside Iran on Instagram. And my second biggest following is in Iran on Instagram, right? So um, Twitter, X, whatever, is not the same. So I used to be really active on X, and it helped sharpen my views a lot. There'd be a lot of really interesting debates about ideas that would happen on X. I know that might seem hard to believe now, but at one time it was like that, especially in the early days. And there were a lot of journalists there, there were a lot of thinkers. And so people would then naturally poach you from media. It was a very easy pipeline if you had good ideas. And in a way, it was a big equalizer because the strength of your ideas would attract people, and you didn't have to have a fancy title and you didn't have to have access to traditional media. You could actually just get your ideas out there on social media and get seen. But there's not that many Iranians on X who are actually inside Iran. So a lot of times people claim that they're inside Iran, but they're not. There's a lot of bot farms that are operating, and we'll get so much into those details, but they're not actually Iranians. They're not there, right? So I don't spend as much time on X anymore because why? I'd rather speak to Iranians inside Iran. I try to do as much Persian language content as I can, but it is difficult because, of course, I'm not as fluent as I am in English, so it involves more preparation. But a lot of the Iranians inside Iran know English anyway, so especially this newer generation. So I converse with a lot of people in my DMs who are inside Iran who tell me things, and I find it really useful. So that's why I spend my time there. And I think it's also a way to get the community mobilized around specific things that we need to do. So the way to get people around a call to action is to go online and let them know about what's going on. Sometimes what's going on can seem really confusing. And there's so many questions around like, why is this happening at the UN? Why is this administration doing this? Why is that happening? And I try to break it down. I don't know that I always do a good job, but I try my best to break it down and just give some information, maybe in a layperson way. A lot of the videos that I get a demand for, and I can't really keep up with it, to be honest, is breaking down legal issues because the legal issues can seem really complicated. And I try to break it down in a way that's understandable for anybody, regardless of if they have a legal background. But those do take, like, they're not that easy to make, of course. So it does take a little time. But I have so many requests. Can you speak about this issue? Can you speak about that issue, this issue? I try to do as many as I can.
I mean, I think the reason that so many people come to you, Gisu, is there's not that many people that have the expertise, but also have the moral fortitude. It feels to me like you're someone that really tries to hold on tight to like the ethics of what you do. And I sort of wonder like if you were to think about today, like where we're at today in history, with everything that's going on in the Middle East, like how would you describe what you feel and see today as it relates to the region that we come from?
I think one of the interesting things is just how many people are realizing truths that people who've been working in the field have known for a long time. So, one thing I see, for example, is when there has been the celebration of the Houthis recently, like all of a sudden, I mean, look, I've been working on issues related to the Houthis for years, right? In terms of trying to hold them legally accountable for certain things. There's a lot of bad players in Yemen, the Houthis being one of them. And there's a whole body of accountability work that has gone into that situation. And then I looked online and I saw that all of a sudden the Houthis were being celebrated. Um, and I think that comes from a lack of knowledge. It really comes from people not reading, not being informed, not being subject matter experts, and yet going online and having an opinion. And I I think that social media is amazing for the equalizing effect. I think it's so important that there aren't some voices that are considered to just be the voices we should listen to just because they have a fancy title next to it. It should be informative, substantive voices, but it should be more decentralized, more democratic in a way. So I like that side of it. I think the downside of it is that you could have a really catchy 60-second clip that is completely disinfo from the start to the end. And it could be reshared, thousands, hundreds of thousands of times. And if somebody just says something in an authoritative way, and puts up some like evidence to back it, they could think that it's the truth, but it might not be. And I think people are very susceptible to that when they actually don't have the core knowledge. So there's that piece of it. The other thing that I see is some people are starting to realize, oh my goodness, there are a lot of people around the world who run cover for brutal dictatorships, like who are completely fine as long as something is, they're against imperialism or they're against military action or they're against whatever, but only if it's the US. If Russia is doing it, it's like no problem. If the Islamic Republic is doing it, it's no problem. On the flip side, you have the others who the US can do no wrong, right? And it's only the Islamic Republic that's problematic, or it's only Russia that's problematic. We have a lot of politically selective actors out there, and not as many who are really willing to look at facts for what they are and be like, this situation and this situation is bad. This situation is also bad. People can't sit with all these different realities. Like they have to be very black and white. And I mean, maybe that's why I'm wearing this jacket today. I don't know, but I just find this like black and white really challenging. And that is also why people who do the kind of like methodological work that doesn't lend itself easily to snappy messages, sound bites, or like very authoritative like ways of stating something about an issue and who might deal more in the nuance. That's why they have trouble, I think, communicating to an audience that doesn't have like isn't going to pay attention to like a 5-minute video, right? Because some of these things are complicated, they involve a lot of nuance. I've tried to boil down the messaging as much as possible, um but even my videos are sometimes so long, like it's hard to really grapple with that. I think it's not that simple always.
It's really not simple. And as someone who themselves has shared information that was incorrect and had to like answer like, oh God, like that number was wrong and this information was wrong or that term was wrong. But you get so like revved up in the emotion of how you feel that, and I think there's like an addiction to the algorithm because you also want to be heard. Like I made a Houthi video because I was just like, my mind was like mind blown over that whole thing.
Yeah, like we do not love the Houthis. Like what is
Like it just
happening
went,
here?
that's what I mean.
Yeah.
I saw this Instagram go up and it was like, yay, the Houthis resistance. And I was like, no, 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 no.
Yeah.
but it's really hard to, well, it's really hard to present factual information, Gisu. I find, like, I'm always like trying to find the real numbers, and so many places that I get the numbers from, people will say, well, this is not a legitimate place. It's especially today. Amnesty International is a fraud, UN's a fraud, the Red Cross, like everyone's like, I don't, and all the organizations that I trust, even like the Washington Post, New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, like all of a sudden, like we live in an era where you can't really trust. Well, I do feel like I can still trust because I use my brain to assess and read, and I don't think I was ever raised to take everything as like black or white. But I do think the need for someone like you is more and more important. I think your role for Iran in the region will grow and become even more important. We are like in a place right now where we desperately need to be guided and directed and educated by people who actually know what they're talking about, who actually have background in the context and have information, who are willing to share and learn. There are not that many people that are willing to share and learn who also have a background, which is why you're so unique. And I think our audience can learn a lot from you if they're willing to be patient for more than 50 seconds and to ask questions. One of the things I struggle with when I watch your content is I'm always like, I just want to know what she thinks. What does she think about this topic? Like, you know, the most controversial one that you did recently was around the South African case brought against Israel. And I watched that video like 3 times and I still couldn't exactly tell what you think or didn't think. But do you feel that everyone also wants you to have an opinion?
Maybe. I don't know. And often I don't necessarily have a hard opinion because I'm looking at it more legally and we're trained to argue both sides of an issue. So the fact that I'm so, and I guess this is the thing, the contrast is I'm obviously such an activist when it comes to Iran, but we shouldn't mistake that for I'm an activist in general because I'm not. I'm a lawyer and I can be an advocate, but I'm not an activist. I don't have an activist personality. The reason that I am an activist on Iran is because of the personal connection, because of how much work I put into it, right? But like I work on a lot of people don't know that I work on a lot of countries. Iran is just one of the countries that I work on. We work on China, Ukraine, Venezuela, Afghanistan. Like there's a number of countries that I work on, and I'm not an activist necessarily on those issues. So I think that's why if I'm talking about, let's say, the issues in Israel Palestine, you're not going to see me start to say, we've got to support this side. Like, that's never going to be something that I'm going to say. I'm just going to talk about the harm to civilians because that's really what I focus on. So I'm always on the side of people, but it's only
Yes.
with an issue like Iran that you'll really see me take a much more activist tone and say how I'm feeling and what I think about a situation. I just don't do that in general. So that's
I
why.
I commend you for that. It actually creates better hygiene in myself, to be honest with you. I think that that's like a habit that we should all really try to think a lot about. Although it's really hard to not like this time is such a weird time because even though, like so many people will say, well, Iran's not involved in this conflict, but every Iranian on the planet feels that Iran is involved. Um we you know it's forget about how we feel. Like if you just go to the supreme leader's Instagram, which is taken down now, but I still follow like his side accounts, but all of those channels not just claim the seventh, but celebrate it, talk about the great things that will come out of it because of it. They talk about Mahdiism, they talk about the region, they talk about imperial, their version of the West doesn't really understand that, like, the imperialist, that they are also imperialist, like that the Iran is also its own like imperial colonizing like empire that is looking at a very large region that I mean, I frankly think that they're like massively maniacally talented at what they've done throughout that region. Like when I first met you, when I first met you, Massey, and so many other people, people would say you don't really fully understand like the breadth of this thing, and Amir Sultani, like, and now I really understand what everyone was saying, which is like this thing is they're way more operational and influential throughout this region than I originally thought. I mean, they're
Yeah,
quite
speak to any
dangerous.
Syrian, speak to any Syrian and they'll tell you just how, I mean, the Islamic Republic has totally taken over Syria, right? So, yes, their reach is wide and they are involved in a lot of cross-border crimes, and that's really something to look out for. But they're striving to be a regional power, so that's why. My problem with them isn't as much about what they seek to do in terms of geopolitical games. My big problem with them is that they brutalize their own people on a very, very extreme level. And then they've also entered conflicts where they're brutalizing other people, like in Syria. So that's my issue with them. I'm less for you'll see, I won't get as involved in like talking about, well, the US is right to do this, or like, how dare the Islamic Republic do this to a US base, or what, like that kind of stuff that's a whole other game. That's a security focused consideration. Those are geopolitics. And all these governments have their national interests and things that they wish to do and don't do. And that's not an area of analysis of mine. But the thing that really it makes the Islamic Republic an outlier and one of the worst human rights violating regimes around the world is how they brutalize their own people and what they're doing in other contexts. Like Syria was particularly brutal, and they rewrote the whole thing as if Qasem Soleimani and others were just saving them from ISIS. That was a narrative I heard often, like they saved us from ISIS coming to Iran. That's what they were doing in Syria. It's like, no, they weren't. They were murdering women and children. That's what they were doing in Syria, and now they basically occupy the country. So it's a mess. It's a mess in so many ways, but really finding people across the Middle East, a lot of activists that I know across the Middle East and North Africa who we have very similar issues, or who were looking at Iran, the Islamic Republic's influence and really trying to counter that. That's been something that, we've been working on for years. And it's been very frustrating to have a lot of, I guess, voices who are anti US essentially somehow try to stick the work against the Islamic Republic into this binary. The first time I really saw us break that kind of binary was with the Women Life Freedom protests. That's why it was so important. And that's why I was very hopeful about what was happening. Because up until then, as a person who works on documenting human rights violations in Iran and trying to bring accountability for that, you're always getting accused of being CIA, like whatever, like it's as if you're then taking a US position when in reality it's not about the US versus Iran. Like that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the fact that the Islamic Republic is a brutal dictatorship in and of its own self. Whether there's US sanctions, whether there's whatever, that doesn't change what that dictatorship would be. They did not start to pass discriminatory laws against women and religious minorities because of the US. That's not even relevant. There's like a big discussion around that. And we've been fighting that for years. And there's a lot of people who are really misguided um, in the West who, write about how great the Islamic Republic is, or truly think, they're just a victim of the US or whatever. And it's maddening. So if you work in this space, you've been dealing with that for a long time. I think some of that is really coming to a head now because we see on social media people celebrating, Osama bin Laden, celebrating the Houthis. It just really brings that into focus.
One of the things that I've really had to digest over the past few years is the presence of pro-Islamic Republic journalists and writers and advocates who really have done a great job of sort of messaging this Iran's a victim of the West and America, and they're just fighting them off, trying to maintain their own sovereignty. But it's a whole nother thing since October 7th to see like Gen Z and young millennials globally come through and like double down on this message. Like it has broken the Iranian diaspora and all the diasporas, frankly, like the Palestinian diaspora, the Jewish diaspora, like every diaspora has sort of like cracked over this I don't know what you want to call it. Is it a fracture? Something has happened where, there was a explosion of digital support for the Islamic Republic and all of their proxies, I guess, is what I would say. And the the perception I had was that the left was like all of a sudden my left was like really, which was like very hard as an Iranian because you're like, why is everyone not there for women life freedom? And because women life freedom felt to me and feels to me like such a universal, like non-denominational, but also denominational in the sense like inclusive of ethnicities and religions and Kurdish and Jewish and Baha'i and Zoroastrian and queer. And it just felt very, well, it's frankly the first time I really could see myself in Iran, Iranian, in the diaspora. I mean, I haven't really left the seat since it's sort of the vortex of that happened. Um, but is this real? Or do you think these are just like digital propaganda bots and like AI machine working against us? Like, do you genuinely believe that like the Republican Party, the Conservative Party would have you believe that all of the left is now supporting anti-American propaganda? Like, I don't know if that's really true or if that's just what the internet wants us to think.
I think what I can say is that there was always this problem of if you work on Iran and if you are critical of the Islamic Republic, you do not have natural allies with leftists. The
Why?
Islamic Republic, because the Islamic Republic positioned their revolution as a populist one, as an anti-imperialist one. And the reality is that a lot, so the way I see what I'm seeing now, and I say this as somebody who, I guess, I never talk about my politics online. I'm pretty mute about that, but I am um, definitely on the left. So very much, right? So that's what's kind of crazy is like on foreign policy, I'm not. So if it comes to domestic issues, firmly on the left. But on foreign policy, I haven't been for a long time. I'm not on the right either. I'm just not anywhere on foreign policy. I'm just very human rights oriented. And sometimes the decisions being made are not supportive of human rights. So sometimes it was really amusing to see people try to throw what's happening in Iran into like a very US centric bipartisan lens because it's so irrelevant, truly, to what kind of actions people will take around the world. You see people who are very supportive of Iran human rights who are more leftist. You see people who are supportive of Iran human rights on the right, you know? So it was odd to see people like kind of inject their own very US centric partisan view onto this because that's neither here nor there, in my opinion. I think if you work on foreign policy, you can't be partisan like that as well. If you're an advocate, you really have to speak to everybody, and I do speak to everybody. But in terms of domestic politics, I'm on the left, right? So for a long time, I've known, like, yikes, what's going on here? Because the people that I would, admire who are in office would not necessarily be supportive of legislation that I had that was on human rights related to Iran. Whereas I never had to appeal to any more like Republican or like more right of center offices, they were always automatically on board. And they weren't necessarily on board for the right reasons, right? They were on board because of their political animus and like all of that. So it's not like a human rights focused reason, but they would be more likely to back it. So I wouldn't actually have to spend as much time trying to convince them. It was more trying to convince like more progressive offices to get on board by appealing to their human rights positioning and for them to see that I'm principled on human rights across the board. So one thing that might be surprising is people will say, well, why is Gissou, taking these positions, but then she'll like talk about the rights of Palestinians. It's like, well, obviously I'm going to because I take these positions on every single conflict, every country situation. I don't pick sides or favorites or this or that. I just look at protection of civilians. That's it. So this is a long-standing problem. This isn't anything new, I'd say. And my theory about this is just that I'm from the generation that remembers the Iraq War. And I was very active and I was super radical back then. I was in college, I would lay in the street in front of oncoming traffic as part of protests to protest the illegal invasion of Iraq. And, that was another time. And that was what I thought was best when I was, 21 or whatever I was. But I think a lot of the people who observed what happened and observed the way that the Bush administration went into Iraq really became skeptical of US power, US militarism, the US military industrial project, right? The problem is that they got stuck in that framework when it came to the Middle East. So I feel they view almost all the problems in the Middle East as a US creation.
Mm.
Whereas there are horrific dictators that on their own would exist regardless of if there's US military bases there and US influence. Like that these both of the things can be true. And so I feel that a lot of the people who were sort of really very skeptical of US actions in the region, who remember Guantanamo Bay. I mean, Guantanamo's still open for goodness sake, but like remember all of that. They then became the professors and the teachers of the generation that you now see online, right? And so they're right. They're not wrong. So part of what they're saying is right. The piece that they're missing is that there are brutal dictatorships in the Middle East that exist regardless of where the US is positioned, regardless. And they are brutalizing their own people. And those people also deserve to have people stand up for them. And you're not going to say, I'm not going to, we should just let the Iranian people, we should leave Iran. This is one thing you often hear. We can't intervene in Iran. We cannot intervene. What does intervene mean? What are we talking about? Yeah, we can't, we're not advocating for the US. Well, at least I'm not advocating for the US to launch a military strike in Iran. But what are we talking about? You can't intervene. What we can't like have an opinion. We can't try to mobilize the UN. We can't tell governments to take actions where Iran is concerned. The amount of that I heard was crazy. And I think what the Women Life Freedom movement did was show there are women in Iran, women and men in Iran who are angry with their government. This has nothing to do with the US. And it was a rights based anger. It wasn't about, economic woes, because when it's about economics, then people say, oh, it's the US sanctions. That's why they're in the streets, right? It wasn't about that. It was squarely about human rights. And that's what made the difference. And that's why we saw that countries in, the Africa bloc at the UN all of a sudden were voting in line with these human rights initiatives. We saw that countries in the Latin America bloc were voting in line with these initiatives. And we hadn't seen that historically because it's all about, the US framing. That was a very long-winded answer, but that's how I see it. I mean, this has been a long-standing problem.
I mean, that was a beautiful answer, and I think everyone's going to really appreciate the answer because I have a difficult time framing what is different about the women life freedom movement versus the green movement versus other moments throughout the history of Iran, and also people don't really understand Iranians, like in the middle of this conflict, this war, this, I mean, frankly, let's call it what it is, which is like a human rights disaster, like just an actual tragedy happening in Gaza and Rafah, right? Um, Iranians, God, I feel like, at least for myself, I'll speak for myself, having the like history of the 79 revolution, like knowing how passionate the Islamic Republic has been about Palestine, and sort of in this weird way, what's the right word? Is it co-opting? Is it, what have they been doing over there? What would you, when
Oh
people
my
say to you
God.
like, Iran, what is the like, to me, like, I'll just tell you my like uneducated, unlawyered voice. Like, I'm like, I feel like these people have just like appropriated this cause,
Yeah.
this injustice. Like, Palestinian people have been screwed for a long time. They, I I don't have any, I'm like the least educated on this topic, and I've said this on record and I'll say it again. I stuck my face in a paper bag on this issue for the past 40 plus years of my life on purpose. I never wanted to know about Israel Palestine because it's it's I don't even think I had the emotional intelligence to deal with it until now. Frankly, it's so complicated. It's such an intense issue. But when people say like, why are Iranians in the middle of this issue, whether you're for Palestine or with Israel, whatever, first of all, I think people are idiots and they don't know that there's many, many, many Iranian Jewish people. Like, they don't know how close Jewish people and Iranians are. Just forget about this conflict. Like, Iran has a history of I mean, we had happy, healthy, like, communities of Jewish people like in our country for a long time, and um I think that's something that universally we're really proud of, and that's just a part of our culture. But people in this conflict have been like, why are Iranians in the middle of this issue, whether you're for Palestine or for Israel? And what's your answer to that? Like, why are we so tied up into this thing?
So we have this. I mean, I wouldn't say it's a joke, but it's just something ridiculous, which is that when we would be at UN meetings, inevitably, no matter what the issue was, when the Islamic Republic representatives go up, they talk about Palestine. So it almost becomes like we said, like it's like a drinking game. Like every time they say Palestine, take a shot, right? And this held true in fall of 2022 when we were going to set up, the fact-finding mission on Iran. There was a special session of the UN Human Rights Council when we were at the vote to remove the Islamic Republic from the Commission on the Status of Women. Always Palestine. What does Palestine have to do with the issues concerning the Islamic Republic's brutalization of people within the territory of Iran? Nothing, zero. They just throw it out there because they're instrumentalizing the Palestinians. And I think they're doing them a huge disservice. There are so many Palestinian activists that I know who are very supportive of women life freedom. I see like this narrative that like, oh, where were the Palestinians? I'm like, they were there. At least the ones that I know that work on these issues were super supportive of our cause. Maybe we didn't see like mass solidarity protests in Gaza, but I mean, I don't know. I guess I wouldn't be doing that either if Hamas controlled it, right? So it kind of makes sense why you might see that in Israel, but not see that in Gaza. But in terms of like Palestinians who are outside, they've been super supportive, the ones that are human rights centered. But so we have this joke about like this drinking game that they just will bring it up no matter what. It's outrageous and it's not doing any service to them. And I think the problem though is then a lot of Iranians inside Iran see that and they just say, forget the Palestinians. We don't want to, we're not going to support them. And it's like, dude, those people, you know, they don't deserve the Islamic Republic either, like don't, I mean, they didn't ask for that. So I think that's where, we got to keep these things kind of clear and it's not always so clear. I think I mean, just as like a personal note, which, so a lot of times people, they think that I'm a Jewish Iranian, right? So a lot of times people have asked that, Not sure why, but they just not due to anything. I mean, people also think I'm Baha'i because I worked a lot on Baha'i focused issues, so maybe that was it. I don't know. Um, but I had the blessing of growing up in a town in the U.S. that was like half Jewish, basically. So I grew up going to bat mitzvahs and bar mitzvahs, and really had that upbringing. And so, what was really shocking for me, and I grew up in a family that is just very like they just there's no casual racism or anything of any kind. I think because my dad's a scientist and he just views people as molecules, I feel like that was truly just the vibe in the household.
Oh my God, I
And
feel like
I
do we
didn't
have the same dad? We have I
maybe.
think we have the same dad.
But it did me a real service. I mean, the kinds of literature they had me reading as a child was like, we're all one human race, one human family. That's what I grew up. I grew up in like the UN vibe of like that's who we are and we're all friends and blah blah. So it was really shocking to go to college. I went to UCLA as an undergrad, and it was so shocking to go there. It was around the time of an intifada, and there were like really like rabid protests with people taking sides, and I was so naive that I didn't even know there was a problem between Palestinians and Israelis, or it was framed back then. I think that framing has gone away, thankfully, but it was very framed as like Muslims versus Jews issue. And I was so shocked because my family wasn't religious, probably because they had left a theocracy, and probably because my dad, again, is a scientist and views people as molecules. We just didn't have an upbringing in religion, but of course, like ancestral, like our family was Muslim, so fine. Like if somebody asked me when I was younger, if somebody would ask me what your religion is, I guess I would say Muslim because I just didn't know. I didn't even know what that was. And then when 9/11 happened in the US and there was like such a focus on what that meant, was when I first started to get really introspective around like what is that? What are the beliefs? Like why is this being weaponized in a certain way? So it was shocking for me to go to campus and see these people protesting each other. Like I just couldn't it was so out of my conception because it just wasn't how I grew up. And the reason I mention this is not to share like a story about my life, but to just say that what I find really fascinating in all this is that there are people that unfortunately have taken their position on maybe what the Israeli authorities are doing and have extended that into like a very sort of like anti-Semitic, like you can't deny that there's like something going on that doesn't feel right in many, many spaces. And there's only like what? I think there's like 16 million Jews on the planet. Like they're not a particularly high numbers community. And so most of the people who are engaging in that kind of sloganeering or whatever, I don't even know if they've like met a Jewish person. Like I seriously question if they even have. And so I wonder how susceptible they are to like groupthink or stereotypes. And I mean that more globally. I don't mean that as much in the US because I think in the US, there's like, especially if you live on the coast, like there's a lot more. And also we learn about the Holocaust in school, like that's part of our teaching. That's not true for most of the world. They don't learn about
Right.
that. We don't learn about a lot of things in the US curriculum, but one thing we do for the most part, I think most schools like teach that. And so we're aware of those horrors and we're like aware of that. So I just wonder, I feel very lucky that that was my upbringing and not a different kind of upbringing where I might need to seriously deprogram. Because I'm always
Yes.
shocked when I hear kind of like casual anti-Semitism or just like very casual remarks that are like, whoa, sometimes I've been witness to that as an adult, and it's extremely shocking, I have to say, and something I don't quite understand because it just wasn't what I grew up with.
It it feels really uncomfortable right now. I normally like we're, like we go to Shabbat dinners, Chris's, but but it's just been such a like weird few 4 or 5 months because I've never in my life had my Jewish friends ever ask me if I'm Muslim. Was I
Hmm.
raised practicing Muslim? Like, I know you're not Muslim, but like, were you raised Muslim? A friend of mine asked that, like, we happened to have been at their Shabbat, you know? And I was just thinking, like, what a wild time because we're all like so triggered right now that it's just a weird time. I don't know how to describe it. I'm really just shocked by the anti-Semitism. I'm shocked by the Islamicism fetishizing and like fetishizing of the like anti-imperial, like people would talk about North Korea is amazing. Like even seeing Tucker Carlson and Russia saying that Russia's got certain things figured out that America doesn't. Like there's the anti-Arab sentiment is deep and dark and gnarly. Like people say crazy stuff about Muslims and Arabs. Like so yes, it's a weird time.
Yeah, my DMs are filled with people. Filled, I don't know, but it was about a dozen messages, so kind of filled, saying that all Palestinians are terrorists and the
Yes.
children, who cares if they're killed because they're going to grow up to
That I've
be
screenshot
terrorists. So,
I have screenshot these because they're from people who are like public facing grown ass humans with like public, you know, personas and profiles, lawyers, doctors telling me, because I think it's at first I was like, this is Islamic Republic, hate the Hamas, hate the Houthis. But then as this conflict is within like a week or two, you're like, oh no, this is getting out of control. But there's like an urge, intense algorithmic urge to pick a side right now. Why is everyone, especially within the Iranian community, like why is there an urge for us to pick a side?
again, because it goes to the black and white, I think people are not comfortable with understanding that that like things might not be what they seem, and that it's really not that simple. I also see people warning against people who say it's not that simple. They're like, actually, it is really that simple. It's like, is it? If it was, I think we would have figured this out already. No, like, I don't think so. But one thing that's really important for me and why I haven't spoken on this that much, other than to give like legal analysis and things like that, is because right now we should just be platforming voices who are directly impacted by the conflict. That's my personal opinion. I think it's fine that people want to talk about it or whatever, but it's like unless you are really directly in harm's way, like we only have so much bandwidth, right? So I want to hear from those people and how they feel about something. And the problem is like right now, international media obviously does not have access to Gaza. So for the most part, so it's really hard to get those voices or even see what's happening. Really, social media has been the only way that we've had a clue into what's been going on. But you see a lot of dehumanization of pretty much everybody. What I'd say is like the two times I got the most fush, like I got the most curse words aimed at me, was when on October 8th, I posted a post about Shani Luke, who tragically was killed by Hamas. And she was like the beautiful, dreadlocked festival goer. And it was just such an emotional feeling because when I saw her, I thought of like myself when I was her age and, what a horrific way to go. So it was just a very like emotive, immediate post. And I got mass unfollowed. I don't know, but like, immediately like 100 or so people unfollowed. And then I got, DMs saying that somehow I was going to justify the murder of Palestinians by like expressing support for this like beautiful Israeli girl. Crazy. The second time this happened to me, that was the first time. The second time this happened to me that I got all the push was when I posted a video about Rafah the other week, and I was rightfully pointing out that there's like 1.5 million civilians there, that Palestinians, if Netanyahu is actually not bluffing and makes good on his promise to go in and do what he wants to do, that he's going to kill, you know, thousands of people who are absolutely not combatants. Like there's going to be tons of civilians who are killed alongside anybody that they're trying to target, who they say is Hamas. And how upset that made me that it's like at that point. And then, of course, like tons of profanity, like horrible messages, like all Palestinians are terrorists followed. What I see is that what all these people have in common, regardless of what side they're on, is that they're ready to dehumanize an entire group of people, which to me is probably the most concerning thing. That people were
Yes.
so quick to like not recognize the humanity of that Israeli woman who was tragically killed, and people are so and the hostages period, they're like not, understanding the humanity there, and then at the same time they're not understanding the humanity of like thousands and thousands of Palestinians who've been killed. The reason why sometimes I say Palestinian, I emphasize the children part, is because in no way can children be combatants, and that is the
Yes.
critical distinction, right? And so there's like a legal reason I'm saying that. Some people are like, well, what difference does it make about, like, it makes a big difference, because if your purported military objective is to take out Hamas, then
Yeah.
killing lots and lots and
But
lots of children does not slot into that. Like an 8-year-old is not part of Hamas, so therefore they could never be a combatant under any definition, right? So it's like that's
I
the
mean,
problem.
for me, the bigger problem beyond like going one step further is I don't even think I don't believe you can disarm or like getting rid of Hamas. Like, what does that even mean? Like I don't even understand like
Well,
that KPI
there's a
in that
mil-
sense.
there can be a
Like
legitimate military objective, and that part I get. And I think I've tried to be clear about that. Like, if a group is attacking you and they consist of militants, then there are like laws of war that apply to taking them out as a military target. The problem we get in here is that when you get into sort of indiscriminate killing because you're just bombing whole areas, it gets more complicated, obviously. And also, if the purported aim is to free the hostages, I don't really see how like bombing areas where the hostages would be is necessarily going to help bring that about. There are a lot of non-state actors that take hostages, unfortunately, around the world. There's also a lot of state-sponsored hostage taking. In almost no scenario is the country that has the hostages taken go and bomb the other entity. Like that just normally doesn't happen because it's not practical. So when the Islamic Republic takes hostages, in their hostage diplomacy type ways, you don't see the US bombing Iran. Like it wouldn't be feasible, right? When Russia took Brittany Griner or, Paul Whelan, like we don't bomb Russia because
I mean,
obviously
it
there's
is feasible.
consequences.
We could be doing it. That's the question I've
No,
never really.
no, because Russia's a nuclear power. So it's about deterrent. It's not practical, feasible, or like possible from a security analysis. But because one could bomb Gaza with little to no repercussion, that is why we see that happening. This isn't the typical way hostage negotiations go, right? It doesn't usually go with then there's a whole full-blown military operation with it. It's more of like there's a as horrible as it is, there's usually a negotiation. You make a deal and then you get the hostages out. That's usually what happens because you're usually not up against a group that you can just eliminate, right? And so that's the tricky thing here. And I don't quite understand at this point what the aims are, if I'm
What
being
you're
honest.
saying is so intense. What you're saying is so intense. It's so intense.
I mean, I think it's really, I think that's why we also see the families of the hostages say, please make a deal, because they obviously want their loved ones to come home.
They want
And
a
I think that,
ceasefire. They want their hostages. They want their families back. I've met with these families. I've literally met with so many of these families. They do not, they're just like, we just want a ceasefire to get these hostages out. But yeah. So Gisu, we're like operating in a world where like there are unhinged leaders right now all over the place. We've got
yes,
Putin, we've got Supreme Leader, we've got Bibi Netanyahu, we've got Donald Trump who's on the prowl. You've got I mean, you have Venezuela, like I mean, there's a long list of like dictators are kind of on the rise right now. Like democracy is this just a headline? Like I saw like a mutual friend of ours post something like is like democracy really not on the ballot? Is it? Are we in the
I
era
think
like
we're
are
in
we
a
forget is it like not the era of influencer but like entering the era of dictator theocracy? Like is that what's
I think
happening?
authoritarianism is on the rise in some ways. I think one moment that really level set things again was Ukraine. I think people understanding really what's at stake and what values are at stake and how people rallied around the Ukrainian desire to be a democracy and to be free from an authoritarian state really resonated with a lot of people and made maybe European countries understand that they shouldn't take their freedom for granted. Um, so I do think there was like a setback for many years, and that's due to globalism, that's due to authoritarian states and their officials taking advantage of free societies. So, because we live in a more, when you live in transparent societies, these authoritarians can come over, they can buy property, they can exert influence, they can, repress dissident communities, right? Because we have open, transparent societies where you can own property, even if you're not from there, like all those values that make open societies and transparent societies great are also what authoritarians can easily manipulate and influence. And so that's really the trouble. Also, in free societies, you can express your views. And some people might have views that are fascist. And some people might have views that are authoritarian. And they might be trying to replicate those systems domestically. So that's also something. It's just an inherent tension. And then I think I've really been wondering lately whether or not nonviolent, peaceful resistance is still the path forward, in the sense that when you're dealing with such brutal dictatorships, like how do you ultimately dislodge the dictator? I'd like to think that with time and decades and united nonviolent resistance, that gets the job done. But lately things have been happening that just make me wonder, I mean, Navalny was killed. um it just feels like there's a lot that's bleak. I mean, in Venezuela, Maria Corina Machado, who's the opposition candidate, was disqualified from running, and then her entire political apparatus is behind bars right now, more or less. So it makes you wonder, will that prevail? Will the peaceful forces prevail in the end? But I think ultimately history has shown that nonviolent resistance is always like the most sustainable way. So I still continue to hold on to believing that that's true, even if on the day to day level things are happening that might feel like setbacks. I think in the long arc of history, we'll see that that was actually the best way forward.
So do you think like what happens to Iran from here? You think?
Um, wow, I mean, that's a really big question.
These are the questions
That's
I
a
think
huge.
about when I'm like, Gisu, you know what my life has become? My life at night used to become all the things I wanted. And now I lay at night and I think, I wonder what Gisu thinks about what happens to Iran.
There's no way. There is no, Moj, you're just messing with me. No, a few things I think. The young, like honestly, the young people in Iran are really the hope because they're so brave. They were willing to put everything on the line. I do think we're in a really dangerous moment right now. We're in a dangerous moment because I mean, obviously, Israel Palestine is dangerous for the people who are most impacted by that. So I don't want to speak in a way that seems like dismissive. Like, it's not about us, truly, but there are real political implications of that. And one of that is that a lot of states around the world view the Islamic Republic as part of any kind of solution because of their control over these non-state actors, even though they claim they don't control them, over their control and financing of these non-state actors. And so they're going to censor what they say about the Islamic Republic. They're going to act differently with the Islamic Republic because they view them as part of one of the parties that has to be consulted, just in the way that Qatar is playing this role, right? They're they're viewed as a party that has to be consulted. And so I think that's very dangerous for us in the Iranian community in terms of advocacy, because we lose the countries that might have been empathetic because they saw how brutal the Islamic Republic's treatment of ethnic minorities were, that they just killed in fall of 2022, of women that they're brutalizing, continue to brutalize to this day. I've been talking to a lot of states because of, different advocacy reasons and things like that, and some of them are like, "Oh, isn't everything in Iran fine now because we don't see any protests?" And I was like, actually, there's mass facial surveillance technology to police whether or not women are wearing proper hijab. These women are suffering incredible economic consequences, negative consequences, because their cars are basically taken from them if they're not complying with mandatory hijab, and their license plate will be reported if the facial recognition technology observes that they're not wearing hijab. Citizens have been made to turn on one another because now they can report whether or not women are wearing proper hijab. Business owners are expected to not serve women that do not have hijab on, and they also um, are being put out of business. So a restaurant or a cafe their operations will be closed if they're servicing women that don't have hijab on. To be clear, not in like the rich affluent areas. Those places have usually avoided all of this because they pay bribes or whatever. But just like in the more broader situation, because a lot of women started to not comply with mandatory hijab laws. But all of that, like, I think the regime was just waiting until the 1 year mark of Mahsa Amini's death. Once they managed to effectively like stamp out any potential of a redo, and then the events in Israel Palestine really escalated shortly thereafter. So we see like a very seismic shift, unfortunately, in terms of how the globe is viewing what's happening there. So all we can do, I think, as people who care about Iran and can work on the outside, is really to make sure that it's clear to the media and others that, like, no, the things have not improved in Iran. It's now a very oppressive, repressive situation. But because you don't see visible street protests doesn't mean that things are better. And it also doesn't mean that people are happy. Like, it just doesn't mean that. So I think that's really important. And I've been very concerned to see countries kind of think, oh, well, everything is fine. This also underscores why I think I understand why people are so fixated on the US and the Biden administration, because they're kind of stuck in like the 1979 way of thinking, when, ultimately the US had a different kind of power on the global stage, and you could really like trace whatever Carter did to some of the events that occurred, right? But that we're not in that situation anymore. I mean, China has a lot of power. Like, a lot of countries have a lot of power, and they're making deals with each other, and the US is not necessarily always at the table. So I think understanding that is really key to understanding why it can't just be like, what is the US doing on Iran? No, we have to like make sure other countries are on board because they have votes, they have a say. They're also building their own economic alliances, whether it's BRICS or whatever, like, it's not all about the US. And I guess that's what I try to focus on in my work, because there's a lot of people focused on the US. I think that's important, but it's not the only factor. Far from it, actually.
So who are the key players in your mind that have to be on board for a free Iran or a regime change?
I don't think they have to be on board, but what I would like to see is, so I'm going to Latin America in a few days, and the reason is to talk to Chile, Argentina, Colombia, Brazil, like regional powerhouses in Latin America that make important decisions at the UN, economically, in trade deals, all that. And I'm going to talk to them about gender apartheid, and making that a crime, but also about Iran. So, and then there'll be another block of countries that we need to go to, and then also in Africa. Africa is really important. The vote count right now for Africa is looking really grim in terms of which countries are actually going to support an extension of the UN fact finding mission on Iran. And I really believe a huge chunk of that is because of the shifting politics, because of people saying that there's hypocrisy when the US is vetoing every ceasefire resolution at the UN Security Council. Like there's just a lot going on that is going to impact our issues on Iran. These are all connected. So, in terms of Africa, I mean, there was a lot that was made out of like South Africa and its application at the ICJ. South Africa is a country that we really need to have on side when it comes to like I think it's very important to get them to at least not vote no to things and also to like to be more open to be like okay like the Islamic Republic is also brutalizing its citizens. That's why gender apartheid was something that was very important, I think, for us to sort of emphasize with South Africa because they have the experience of apartheid and to explain like that's happening in Iran. So there's like a thinking behind it that also goes to the experience of these countries and what would resonate with them.
I know you have to go in a minute. I don't know if we have time for one more question. What do you think?
I think maybe one more. Yeah.
If
Yeah.
you have, I guess, one ask of whether it's politicians or millions of various different ethnicities that are in the diaspora, the left, the right, the progressives, like what's your ask from a human rights perspective in Iran and Afghanistan? You look after numerous people and peoples. What's your ask?
My ask is to make sure that we're listening to survivors of human rights violations about what they want. Like, what do they want? And also platforming dissidents. Too often, I'm seeing that the representatives of repressive regimes are the ones that are claiming to speak for a population, but they haven't been elected. They're not representative. They're not the people that represent the people, right? And that's a huge problem. It's always been a problem, but it's becoming more and more of a problem as far as I see it. And these regimes will stop at nothing to eliminate any political opposition. And that's not great. And so states need to be cognizant of that and counterbalance it by making sure that dissidents have a platform. That's the only way to get around that. So that would be my ask. It's a very simple one, but I think it's pretty important.
Well, I think it's a really important ask, and I would ask of you if there's people that you feel that we should be speaking to platform to elevate for them to share their stories. We would really appreciate that. We really want to make this a learning safari, this show, and we're like self-producing it, so it's awesome in the sense that no one can tell us who to interview or what we should be talking about. So if there are people that you think would be important for us to get to know or have other people get to know, that's really the goal because um, I respect you immensely and appreciate your time. And so I would really appreciate that.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on.
I adore you so much. I'm so grateful to you. Iran is so grateful to you. And I just am really happy to know you and call you my friend. So, Kheli Mamnoon, merci, Gissou Nia, Aziz. Appreciate you. Have a good night, my love. Bye.